of thimerosal that would be safe if they weighed 275 pounds. I mean, that's criminal to recommend that. It's also, I think, criminal to tell people in aging centers, get your flu vaccine every year when you're an older person. And everybody that knows anything about the biochemistry of medicine and aging knows that your glutathione levels go in the toilet when you get over 60 years of age. And so you're taking people that have very little protection. Autistic children don't have much glutathione either, by the way. That's part of their susceptibility, shown by Jill James. And we're giving this stuff without even looking at the population you're giving it to. And the other thing is, when you do studies, the flu vaccine doesn't work with a darn. Pardon me, I was raised by a lot of people that came out of World War II, and they talked a little on the rough side. So I've cleaned up my talk quite a bit, but every now and then it slips. This is just testing vaccines, and what this brought up to me was something that we did a little bit later. And if we looked at the toxicity of vaccines on the enzymes that are critical for life, the blue ones were the ones that had thimerosal in them, and if you added 1.25 microliters versus 10, just you can see the inhibition of these enzymes was dramatic. The ones behind them were the exact same vaccine without thimerosal added as a preservative. They had thimerosal in them, but it was a much lower level. So you had to go out to higher levels to see, to 10 microliters to see any inhibition, sometimes not at all. And so what this said was that thimerosal was a major toxic component in vaccines, if you're talking about enzymes or cells or anything else. We did the same thing with neurons in culture. But what I found and what I observed there is we had already done some work on thimerosal inhibition of these enzymes, and the vaccines were killing these enzymes at rates higher than I expected for just thimerosal alone, because I knew how much thimerosal was in them. I'd measured it. And so what it says is there's a synergistic toxicity set up in these vaccines. And we're going to talk about that because it appears that aluminum and some other things in vaccines absolutely enhance the toxicity of ethyl mercury. And that's well known. I mean, it's popular. I didn't invent that. Somebody else did. I just rediscovered it. So what we've done here is the primary hippocampal neurons, and we added thimerosal, and we found that if we added 50 nanomolar, it would kill over 80% of them in 24 hours. And now 50 nanomolar, and remember the concentration in these vaccines, in one vaccine, is 125,000 to 250,000 nanomolar, depending on how much thimerosal they added to it. And you can see it wipes them out very quickly at a very low level. We have to come back. You have to consider some other things, the effects of antibiotic diets and metals on mercury excretion. This is all found in the published literature. I can provide the publications. Rats exposed to antibiotics were severely impaired in their ability to excrete mercury. Milk, rats on a milk diet versus high-protein diets were much less able to excrete mercury. Now, think about a nursing baby that has an ear infection, getting ampicillin or some antibiotic at that time. And then you get the great enhancement of synergistic toxicity with mercury and other heavy metals, for example, lead. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It can increase the toxicity of mercury by over 100-fold. So, and we know that we have many children in the inner city that have mercury or lead and lead in their body. So these confounders, when you listen to some of the prominent people in mercury toxicity in this country, are totally ignored in their papers. They totally ignore the fact. They say, well, this much mercury is safe. I would submit to you that you and your children and all Americans are not rats raised in a pristine cage eating rat chow that's been analyzed to see there's no mercury in it. We're not raised that way. We have people that are toxic, and many of you have had your hair analysis done. You find beryllium, lead. I mean, some of you guys are awful. I mean, from what you have. So, I mean, indicating that depending on what part of the country you're from, you're being exposed to numerous heavy metals. And this is something, again, done by Schubert, 1978. And equivalent, what they did is they found the LD1, or the amount of mercury and the amount of lead that would kill 1 out of 100 rats. And they mixed those two together, except they took the LD of the lead and cut it and diluted it 20-fold and mixed it with the amount of mercury that should kill 1 of 100 rats. When they put those two together, they killed 100 of the rats. So you have, it should be 1 plus 1 at the most equal 2. Instead of that, it equaled 100. So we have to understand and appreciate synergistic toxicities. And I want to tell you, I don't know what effect bisphenol A would have on it. I don't know what effect fluoride would have on the toxicity of mercury. PCBs. I mean, antibiotics, primarily, are just, it's a transport problem, I'm certain. But we have a lot of herbicides and insecticides that we're exposed to that could behave like the antibiotics and prevent mercury removal. So we have to look at these things, and our government does not even do this. But the conclusion on this, mixing borderline levels of 2 toxic metals, it's not additive. It goes up by a factor of sometimes hundreds. And so this comes back to the stuff where we're talking about thimerosal toxicity. Here's our neurons in culture. And we're going to talk about synergistic toxicities that you can absolutely measure with regard to the stability of neurons in culture. These neurons with nothing added will live 24 hours with no problem. If you add aluminum or neomycin, an antibiotic, there's a slight toxicity increase, but not too dramatic. If we have thimerosal alone, it does the same job, killing, you know, large numbers, over 60, 50, 70% here in the 24 hours. But let's go to certain points in here that I picked out. Talk about the antibiotic. At a level where it shows very little toxicity, if you add it to thimerosal at this time, it will show a dramatic increase. I would tell you tetracycline and some other things like penicillin enhance this even more, especially tetracycline. It was known a long time ago that women who were wearing contact lenses with the fluid containing thimerosal as a preservative in their contact lens fluid, when they were put on tetracycline for an infection, could no longer wear their contact lenses because it dramatically enhanced the toxicity, and their eyes would swell and burn up if they put them in together. If we talk about aluminum, aluminum is not that toxic, and at this time, this is aluminum alone, this is thimerosal alone. If you add the aluminum to it, you kill over 60%. It's a dramatic enhancement, and that's the reason the vaccines, when we were testing them for toxicity, why we underestimated the toxic effects, because the aluminum makes the thimerosal much more toxic. For some reason, it's probably a biochemical aspect of that. Now, again, I think the person who talked about bisphenol A will find this data interesting. And I don't have the part of it on here, but I can show some of it a little bit in the subsequent slide. If we go to this point on 50 thimerosal, we can add enough estradiol to totally prevent these neurons from dying from 50 nanomolar thimerosal. I mean, women are just better protected than we are. I mean, men do it. So estradiol is very protective, but if we go over here and add the same level of testosterone with this here, where there's no killing at all, within 3 hours, we see no killing by the thimerosal. The neurons will all be dead if you have testosterone present. And I think something like this is explaining why we have 4 boys to every girl with autism and 8 boys to every girl with Asperger's syndrome. There's definitely a testosterone effect. And in studies done in England where they looked at the amniotic fluid, the only difference between the mothers that gave birth to children with neurodevelopmental disorders, primarily autism, was that they had high testosterone in their amniotic fluid. So I think there is a reason for that. And so we published this about 3 years ago, but here's another one by Oliveira in 2006, and it's estradiol reduces cumulative mercury and associated disturbance of the hypothalamus pituitary axis of overectomized rabbits. And down here it says the estrogenic effects were associated with the reduction of mercury content of the anterior pituitary gland and medial hypothalamus, suggesting a protective estrogenic effect. And then you come back and you look at all the problems our autistic children have, and you see that females are protected more, and if a female has autism, check her testosterone level, and according to Mark Geyer, and these people look at it, these are females with high testosterone levels. This is another one. I'm going to have to go a little faster here, but this just shows you that in agreement with the earlier talk on estradiol, mercury or thimerosal altered NGF, this is nerve growth factor, induced signaling at concentration lower than those that cause neuronal death. So if you can't grow neurons, you might as well kill them. I mean, it's the same thing. It's not a death issue, and so this is something that they didn't see. Your nerve growth factor, a hormone activity, is inhibited by exceptionally low levels of thimerosal, way below nanomolar levels. So we have these observations, and you can read them as good as I can. But I think what we have to do is consider the logic. You know, things have to be sensible. And the fact that autism jumped up, and the fact that we have a lot of these diseases, they're all modern man diseases. The first case of Alzheimer's disease, which is very easy for anybody to look at because your brain is 25% smaller than a normal brain, was found in 1903. We started putting mercury in people's mouths in 1830, 1840, 1850. The first cases of autism were reported as a unique childhood disease in 1941 by Canner. We started putting thimerosal and biologicals and on seed corn and everything else in 1933, 1932. So these diseases didn't exist before, and they can claim, oh, well, you don't know they didn't. No, I wasn't there. I'll have to admit, I wasn't there. But I doubt that the psychiatrists in 1920 couldn't have found children that act as bizarre as some autistic children do. They're like missing a train wreck. This is the one, again, you know, I think if you're going to talk about something, we do know, this is in every textbook, the mitotic spindle, where your cells divide, is based on microtubulin. You have to have tubulin. And so if you're having cells divide, if you have mercury, your cells aren't going to divide right. And your immune system has to have cells divide. Your T and B cells have to replicate, or you can't have an appropriate response. And if you come down here, thimerosal is a very potent inhibitor of phagocytosis. This was in transfusion, 2005. At 1 nanomolar level, it totally inhibited it. And remember, it's 125,000 to 250,000. And it prevents your phagocytes from going up to a bacteria and recognizing it as a bacteria, eating it, chewing it up, and then going up through the lymph system and making an immune response so your immune system can take care of that bacteria. And so why would you put something like that in a vaccine? But it's there. This is a study we did with Dr. Amy Holmes and Mark Blaxell. And she was telling me that, came up to me at a talk like this and said, you can't be right because we've looked at mercury in the hair of autistic children and it's not as high as the control children. I said, well, that's what I would expect. If it's staying in your hair, in your cells, it's not getting in your blood. If it doesn't get in your blood, it doesn't get in your urine, it doesn't get in your feces, and it doesn't get in your hair. And so here's the dramatic difference. You've got to understand, this was all birth hair, mostly when the kids supposedly were in utero, when they're not making bile. And you see that the control children, if we plot the mercury in the hair level, this direction, versus the number of amalgams in the birth mother, it didn't make any difference. The control children showed elevated mercury in their hair relative to the amalgams, but the autistic children didn't. And what this tells you is that the autistic children are not excreting the mercury in utero that they're exposed to. You can try to give it another explanation, but I mean, and I've had plenty of debates about it. I don't see any good response. And if you look at the level in their hair, autistics versus amalgam count, again a big difference. And if you just take the extreme, you know, the mothers who had 8 to 15 amalgam fillings, there was a 12-to-1 ratio of mercury in the normal children's hair versus the autistic, indicating at the very least autistic children in utero and in the first 6 months of birth do not handle mercury like normal kids do. And when you put this together with studies by other people showing that they have elevated mercury in their body burden, they have lower glutathione levels, I mean, you just want to say, duh. I mean, there's something that you really ought to look at. And what response have we got from our government is that to cover this up and to downplay it and to come up with every stupid, I mean, like watching too much television causes autism, having an older father causes autism. I can't tell you how many things I've listened to that make absolutely no sense, that has no scientific study behind it, and yet they'll find it. And here we see, in plotting this data a little further, is that as the mercury level in the birth hair dropped, the severity of the autism increased from mild, moderate to severe. And if you look here, the girls had to be much worse at excreting mercury to get a mild case of autism versus the boys, indicating that there is a genetic, again, a susceptibility factor. If you're female, you have to have less ability to get rid of the mercury, which is a transport problem, and to have an effect because I think your hormones are giving you some protection. The epidemiological studies, there are several things that came out in some of these, and I've read all of these several times. And in the 7-year-old children in the Faroe Islands, the blood pressure problems increased with decreased blood mercury. And I'm telling you that's because they're not effectively excreting the mercury. In the Seychelles, they said boys with higher levels of hair mercury perform better on the average on tests than those that had the lower hair level. Again, I'd say this is because they're the ones that are excreting the mercury. It's getting out in their blood, gets in their hair, and this could be an explanation of this. I don't have the raw data to go over. I'd like to have it sometime when I have more time, but I think this is something that explains some of the conundrums, because many of you here remember when this came out, the ADA said, see, mercury is a vitamin. You need a little bit of it. If you have a little bit of exposure, you'll be smarter. I'm serious. So this is the concept that low levels of mercury in the hair and blood do not imply a lack of toxic exposure or retention in the body. It just doesn't. And I think that's pretty well accepted now. The involvement of the 2004, and this gets into the politics of this issue. 2004 IAOM Committee Institute of Medicine was funded by the CDC. The 2004 IAOM report cleared Thimerosal as being involved in autism and recommended that no further research be done on this issue. Didn't we just hear somebody say something like that? Don't study it anymore, don't look at it anymore. And since then, in Paris, because I'm very much involved with, talking to those people, they looked at the porphyrin profiles and showed that the autistic children are primarily mercury toxic. And this was based on 5 foreign done epidemiological studies of questionable value. Not in my mind, they're not worth a tinker's. They're not very good. Okay. And it totally dismissed all the basic science, where you're showing hard data, where people can go repeat it. Epidemiologists can lie. And I think that's another group of people that we need to get after. Epidemiologists are like lawyers. What answer do you want, and they'll give it to you. And they need to clean up their profession if they want it to be a profession. When people publish, and I can tell you some that come out right now, lousy epidemiological studies that you could drive a freight train through that even a farm boy could look at and say, this doesn't make sense. They ought to lose their ability to publish in their journals anymore. There ought to be repercussions. Because I can tell you, if I faked my data on all the stuff I've shown you that I've done, they would have my hide. They wouldn't let me publish in a scientific journal, and they would probably take my professorship away at the university. So we need to do that. And I would tell you about this IOM study. We had a recent congressionally requested NIH committee. This was done by Joe Lieberman and 7 other senators. Went back and looked at the conclusions made and looked at the epidemiological studies that the IOM used to make that conclusion, and they gave it a very bad evaluation. They said that the studies that they did were lousy. So let's look at who did it. All the CDC data, Verstraeten studied this. He first showed autism rates were enhanced by thimerosal exposure dramatically. I'll show you a slide on this. All the CDC, they manipulated it until it was done, and then all the data was lost or destroyed after it was published. And he now works for a major vaccine producer in Europe. The 2 studies done by Denmark, Madsen and Hibbett, were the main authors. They worked for the Stanton Serum Institute, and this company makes thimerosal-containing vaccines and sells them to other countries because they haven't been allowed to use in Denmark since 1992 because of thimerosal in them. They did these studies. Talk about a vested interest. This study here done by Elizabeth Miller. She's the lady I got in a fight with at the IOM meeting, if some of you watched that tape. After her results were made known to the IOM, the National Health Service of England moved thimerosal from their English vaccines. And her study showed, as well as did the Hibbett and Madsen, that when you took thimerosal out, the rate of autism went up. In other words, it was protective. And that's because it was so poorly done and the data, in my hands, so manipulated. And we had this recent call of the IOM to discuss possible environmental causes of autism in this April. And the first thing out, they explicitly excluded any discussion of the possibility that vaccines might cause autism. And there was such an uproar that they had to reverse that. But that was what they said. We can talk about all environmental toxins. Now, you got to understand, all you got to find is an environmental pollutant or toxicant that went up in Alaska at the same time and the same rate as it went up in Florida, California, Maine, Nebraska, etc. Now you think, what could that be? And the best guess in my part is when they mandated the vaccine exposure to our children at that time, because I think the environment in Alaska is quite different than in Florida. This is the Verstraeten study. All this is obtained by the Freedom of Information Act. This will give you an idea about how honest our CDC and our Institute of Medicine is, because they knew this data, and we got the Freedom of Information Act, the emails that went back and forth indicating they were trying to cover it up. In 1992, it had a risk factor of 7.62. That means, hands down, it's the cause. They couldn't get rid of it, and they had the emails. It just won't go away, this positive response. And we go all the way across to the Simpsonwood meeting, where they had a big meeting, which they embargoed all of it. It still was causal. And so then they do a lot of manipulations, and I can explain this to you, but it will chew up my time if anybody wants to know. They finally get it over here where it's 1, which means it's probably not causal. And then they published it in the Journal of the American Journal of Pediatrics. And then all the work was lost by the CDC and the 14 people that were on the publication. You can't find it. Go to safeminds.org. and read the Freedom of Information Act, it'll make your stomach hurt. The physicians that were at that meeting absolutely participated in a cover-up of the data, and that's criminal. I mean, that's criminal. One guy said he didn't want his grandson, who was just newly born, to get a shot with Thimerosal, and he would make sure it didn't happen, but he didn't protect your grandkids. I mean, that is criminal. It's definitely immoral and unethical, and that's what happened. This is a slide off of the Madsen study published in Pediatrics, and they talked about taking Thimerosal out, and the rate of autism went up. That was their big claim, and this is what's been thrown in my face a dozen times by medical doctors in the United States. Take this in your mind. You remove a very potent neurotoxin exposure to an infant, and the rate of neurological diseases goes up. That doesn't make sense, does it? I mean, that's an incredibly stupid find, and if you look at it, what they're doing here, I think it's just a numbers game. They show no autism rates on the baseline all the way up to 1990. Then they take it out and they do all these things that change the rate to make it go up, and it skews the data. The rate in the United States at this time was about 60 per 10,000, and the highest rate on the 2 to 4 year old, this line right here, was still under 5. I mean, that's like, as I say earlier, many times, that's like looking at the effect of the mosquito on the spread of malaria and doing the study in Alaska instead of the Panama. I mean, if you don't want to find something, look where it's not. Plus you do it. I mean, these people ought to be ashamed of this data. I mean, and this is what the NIH that reevaluated, the IOM, saying this was a well-designed study, said it was severely compromised. They had a nice way of saying it, but the bottom line is it's trash. You can't do this. Again, this is the studies that the IOM did. If you look at them, CDC funded, CDC funded, CDC funded, funded through CDC, done by the SSI, SSI. You can't have people in the business of making vaccines and manufacturing them or promoting their use look at the safety studies. And this is two people, these are David and Mark Geyer. They get hammered as much as I get hammered about this issue. And they have published this data using the same thing, and they're saying that the rate of autism went up with the mandated vaccine program, the removal of Thimerosal, and it starts going down. I think their work is very well done. They don't make any money off of this. And so these are just conclusions that I have, which I've already said, so I'm going to go over them, because I think we need to look at other considerations. A person by the name of Tony Bateson came up to me after one meeting, and he's the head of an autism group in England, and he told me about this time about 14.7% of the English didn't get vaccinated. And I told him, well, why don't you go back and find out how many autistic children you can find that weren't vaccinated. They found 2. They should have found hundreds. In his whole group, there wasn't autism unless you were vaccinated. Dan Olmsted, and if many of you have looked at the thing, you've heard me recommend this to the Institute of Medicine. Go look at the Amish and the Mennonite populations. They don't get vaccinated. How much autism rate do you see there? And he did this. He could find very little. He found 2, and both of them were vaccinated, when he should have found hundreds, by going through there. The Institute of Medicine absolutely refuses to look at the Amish in this regard. It's information. They say they're too inbred. That's a cop-out. I mean, it's a piece of information you should look at. The Health First Clinic, a Chicago clinic that does not vaccinate in the first year of birth, reports no autistic children born since 1985 from a population of about 35,000 babies. So all we would have to do to make this safe is just not vaccinate in the first year of birth, and we wouldn't have these problems. That has not been a consideration even given by the Institute of Medicine or the CDC or the mandated vaccine program. China now has 2.8 million autistic children where they had none before they started importing European vaccines. That's from David Kirby. And so, I think there's some conclusions here, but I think they're pretty obvious what I was done. But I want to talk about now the Robert and Natoff's work done in Paris, where they're looking at the porphyrin profiles. And this is based on the work of James Wood at the University of Washington. And it's real simple, and I'm going to go through it pretty fast. And this is what I call the smoking gun study that was refused to be published in the American Academy of Pediatricians Journal. They turned it down, but it was published in the International Journal of Toxicology. And what they found was that, porphyrin profiles are a very specific trademark, if you look at them right, for mercury toxicity. It's showing a physiological effect in your body if you are retaining mercury. And they found this, and they found that 53% of the autistic children in France were mercury toxic, and they could reverse the toxicity by treating the kids with a mercury chelator. Therefore, the cause wasn't genetic, it was a mercury toxicity problem. Get the same data from people in Norway, and they were the lead researchers, Dr. Natal and Dr. Lathy, on an International Journal of Toxicology article. I may have started that because I was talking about everybody about doing Jim Woods' test when I went to Sweden, and Switzerland and France talking about this. But the bottom line is, I started recommending to American parents of autistic children to have their urinary porphyrin profiles done so they could go and prove that their kids were mercury toxic and not having a genetic problem. And I have gotten over 20, now over 30 of these, and the level, according to the people in France, the level of porphyrin aberrancies, how badly toxic they are, is much higher in American children than it is in French children. And we don't find any, I haven't got yet one autistic child that hasn't come back as not mercury toxic in the United States. Even if they've been chelated with DMSA and DMPS and other things, they still show level. It usually drops with those children, but some children are way over 1,000 in this level, with the normal range being 50 to 90 according to the data. So I think we have a problem here. And this comes back again to what is toxic. What are porphyrins? They lead to heme. Heme is used in the transport of oxygen. The hemoglobin, it carries oxygen to the mitochondria and releases it in that direction. And if you don't have it, you can have all of the oxygen you want and you're not getting enough delivered. And if you look at autistic children, you will find invariably they look extremely pale. They do not have enough heme. Heme has other biological uses in electron transport. It makes ATP. It can prevent energy production. This might have something to do with chronic fatigue. But it's also needed for active P450 enzymes. These are the enzymes that remove organic toxins from your body. Tomorrow, Dr. Adams is going to give you a presentation. He's going to talk about how PCBs, other pesticides, other molecules are higher in autistic children than in normal children. And that's because the enzymes that absolutely make these things water soluble, so you urinate them out of your body, you don't have enough of that enzyme because you don't have enough heme to make it active. It would be consistent with that hypothesis. I would also point out heme is needed to remove beta amyloid protein from human brains. And if you go to the Alzheimer's studies, there is a heme A that is required to do that. It's totally missing, almost totally gone in AD brain, where another heme goes up, and they make the explanation that the beta amyloid is keeping the heme from being produced. And I'm telling them, no, the lack of heme is keeping you from getting the beta amyloid protein soluble and having it excreted. And this is the normal pathway for those of you that like biochemistry, and I had to throw some of this in. But if you have a normal pathway with these enzymes making A, B, C, D, well, these are your metabolic products, if you have an inhibition, like if mercury comes in and kills enzyme 3 and it drops over dead, the level of C goes up, B goes up a bit, and A goes up a bit, but C will really go up, and that's called a crossover point. And that's what you're seeing in this porphyrin profile. You inhibit one step here, and the coproporphyrin levels go way up in mercury, and only mercury does that. And that's what they're looking at with this metabolic study. And in this particular metabolic, we're talking about coproporphyrin. This is the step that's inhibited because it's where the thing goes back in the mitochondria, and mercury inhibits that. And this is the porphyrin that goes up with mercury toxicity. And mercury is the only thing that we know that does that. So, I would recommend to all of you, if you think you're mercury toxic, or if you have patients that you're treating you think are mercury toxic, go look at the porphyrin profiles. I don't care if they have chronic fatigue, MS, ALS, Parkinson's, etc. We need to try and tie mercury exposure in this metabolic process, because it has a lot of secondary effects, into the analysis of these diseases. And it costs $128. You can get it sent to Paris and get the answer back very quickly. I do think there are companies in the United States that are now starting to do this, but before that, we couldn't get it done. Now, I'm getting to the end of my talk, but I'm going to get to this. For those of you that use DMSA and DMPS, they are not true mercury chelators. There isn't enough space between these two sulfur groups for a big mercury atom to fit. This does not happen. And what forms is equivalent of a sandwich complex with DMSA or DMPS and mercury, or DMSA, mercury, and cysteine. But you do not chelate mercury. This is the reason these compounds can cause kidney problems in certain people, because as it goes through the kidney, you only have to break one sulfur bond with one sulfur bond on a kidney protein, and you've got an increased toxicity. so they don't work. So we've made some new chelators. And the new chelator concept is the most available chelators are water soluble because they carry ionic charges. And that means they don't stay in the body very long. You urinate them out. They have a 12-hour lifespan in the body. And this includes all of these, the ones that we're talking about. Most mercury in the body is intracellular or hydrophobic locations where water-soluble chelator is not efficient at removing it. I mean, DMPS doesn't go in cells, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier because it's charged and it's not natural. If you do a chelation, an IV chelation of DMPS on blood, the mercury level in that blood will drop 25%. But within 2 hours, it will be right back at its pre-chelation levels because that tells you you have a mercury body burden in the fat tissue unavailable to these chelators that just replenishes it. And so we designed some new chelators that would be hydrophobic, that enter hydrophobic areas where most mercury would be located, and we designed them to bind mercury much tighter than DMPS. And these chelators have a much longer half-life in the body. They go in there and they sit there for a long time in the fat tissue, and they have a longer period of time to be able to pick up the mercury. And I'm going to show you data that says when they pick up the mercury, they render it non-toxic. And this is what they look. This is what the base compound looks like, and it has a lot of space. This has a lot of degrees of freedom. It's like my hand. If I want to hold something very particular, I can move it exactly right. So can these. And they bind mercury to the level that you have to heat it to 239 degrees centigrade to get the mercury to come off. You can wash a precipitate with this compound with pH 2, that's very acidic, or pH 12 water, and it won't come off. These compounds, when they bind mercury, are exceptionally stable, and there's nothing that I know of within reason in the human body that would cause that mercury to be released by these compounds. And we have two different types. We're trying others. We're attaching groups off the top to make them more water soluble and more susceptible to them. But the neat thing we did, took that compound, that's it right here, and we coupled it with the diethyl linkage to 2 glutathione molecules. It makes it extremely water soluble. We threw this into water with goldfish. We went up to 1.5 millimolar concentration. Didn't bother the goldfish at all. We had another bowl where we didn't put it in.